In the city of New Lyric, a gleaming metropolis nestled on the northern coast of the United States, life was a performance of success and perfection. Its glass skyscrapers seemed to compete in height and audacity, reflecting an often grey sky, but also the shine of a wealth that was measured in access and influence. New Lyric was not just a city, it was a closed ecosystem, a fortress of wealth and power where traditional families and the titans of the new economy coexisted in a dance of appearances and strategic alliances. The beauty of the place was undeniable, but beneath the polished surface there was a cold and rarefied air current. It was a world where success was the only measure of worth, where an invitation to the right event was a social currency more valuable than money, and where imperfection, vulnerability, or the simple lack of a strong surname were treated with the most civilized and cutting of weapons, silence and indifference. In stark contrast to the glitter of Aurelia across the rarely on-time train tracks lay Vero Plains. It was the outlying suburb, the invisible engine that kept the elite city running. Its homes were small, with faded facades and makeshift gardens. Public services failed with disheartening regularity, and opportunities for upward mobility were a distant myth. Yet what Vero Plains lacked in infrastructure and glamour, it made up for in humanity. There was a web of solidarity that bound neighbors together, a sense of community forged in shared hardship. There was genuine affection, exchanges of favors, and a creative survival that transformed scarcity into ingenuity. It was there, in this universe of harsh realities and strong bonds, that lived Lyra Nellis, a young woman whose existence was a daily testament to the invisible but impassable boundary that separated her world from Aurelia's. Lyra Nellis's life, at 27, carried on her shoulders a weariness that seemed much older than her age. Her life was a complex equation of responsibilities, fears, and a pent-up rage against the social invisibility to which she had been condemned since birth. During the day, her nimble fingers passed products through the cash register of a local market, the incessant beeping of the cash register marking the rhythm of her hours. At the end of the day, instead of resting, she dedicated herself to giving free tutoring to the children of the community in a small, improvised room in the back of the neighborhood church. She saw in those curious little eyes a reflection of herself and felt an almost fierce duty to give them the tools that she herself had never had in abundance. Lyra was intelligent, practical, and at times bitter, a direct consequence of the constant battle against a system that seemed designed to keep her, and everyone like her, exactly where they were. The epicenter of Lyra's life, the reason for her tireless struggle, and the source of her greatest anguish, was her older sister, Niall. At 32, Niall lived in a state of increasing fragility, a prisoner of advanced kidney failure that chained her to a dialysis machine 3 times a week. The waiting list for a transplant in the public health system seemed endless, a bureaucratic torture that consumed Lyra's hopes with each passing day. Guilt was a constant companion for her younger sister. Guilt for not earning enough to pay for private treatment. Guilt for not being able to speed up time. Guilt for watching Niall's vitality slowly fade away within the walls of the small apartment they shared. Every penny Lyra saved, every extra hour she worked, was a small sacrifice on the altar of her sister's survival. Despite the physical weakness that consumed her, Niall possessed a lucidity and spiritual strength that served as a counterpoint to Lyra's bitter pragmatism. From the bed where she spent most of her days, she watched her sister sink into exhaustion and pent-up rage, and tried, with her soft but firm voice, to be her moral compass. "You are not the savior of the world, Lyra," she would say during the long, sleepless nights. "You need to breathe. You need to live. Don't lose yourself while trying to find me." Niall's words were both a balm and a torture for Lyra, who felt selfish for even considering her own needs. For her, there was no time for lightness or for the fairy tales she had long since stopped believing in. Her reality was that of hospital corridors, the smells of antiseptic, and the silent countdown that her sister's body seemed to face. Across Aurelia, on the top floor of the towering Morley Tower, a skyscraper that was the symbol of his power, Cale Morley lived in his own version of a prison. At 34, the CEO of Morleytech, a global cyber infrastructure giant, he was a specter to the outside world. He had inherited the empire at 28, after the tragic death of his father, a brilliant but emotionally tyrannical man who had taught him that vulnerability was the gateway to ruin. Kyle had learned his lesson with brutal efficiency, building around himself a wall of impenetrable professionalism and icy detachment. The press called him the robot billionaire, a man who seemed immune to the foibles of affection and worldly distractions, driven only by logic and ambition. The only chink in Cale Morley's armor, the only point of vulnerability in his emotional fortitude, was his 5-year-old son, Ezrin. 3 years earlier, life had violently ripped away his wife, Ilara, a vibrant and radiant artist, in a car accident he refused to talk about. Grief had closed him off, rather than opened him up, and all the love and concern he couldn't process had been channeled almost obsessively toward little Ezrin. The boy, a quiet child with a vivid imagination and severe asthma that required constant care, became the center of Cale's universe. But this love manifested itself as a suffocating security protocol, a constant surveillance that robbed the child of the spontaneity and lightness of childhood. Cale feared losing his son so much that he ended up imprisoning him in a gilded, overprotective cage. Ezrin Morley, on the other hand, found refuge in his own world of silence and color. The boy drew compulsively, as if colored pencils were the only language capable of expressing the complexity of his feelings. And on his sheets of paper, a face repeated itself with a constancy that intrigued and worried Cale and his tutors. The face of a young woman, with a kind look and dark hair, whom he drew in different scenarios, sometimes smiling, sometimes with a serious expression. Kyle had tried a few times to ask his son who that woman was, but Ezrin would shut down, silence being his only response. What Cale had no idea was that that face belonged to the clearest and most crucial memory of Ezrin's short life, the face of the woman who had saved his life during a terrible asthma attack 2 years earlier. The event had been etched into Ezrin's mind with lightning clarity. He had been in a park with his then nanny when the air seemed to leave his lungs. The feeling of drowning, the panic in the nanny's eyes as she didn't know how to use the emergency pump, the fear of the approaching darkness, and then the appearance of that woman. She wasn't wearing a doctor's uniform, nor did she look wealthy. She was just a young woman passing by. But she acted with a calm and firmness that dispelled the panic. She calmed him with her voice, administered the medicine with precision, and stayed by his side, whispering comforting words until his breathing returned to normal and help arrived. He never learned her name. She had disappeared into the crowd, but her face, her voice, the sense of security she had given him, became a secret amulet in his childhood memory. It was in this landscape of parallel universes, secret pains, and unshared memories that an elegant and unexpected piece of paper appeared in Lyra. Nellis's life, her neighbor in Vero Plains, an octogenarian named Mrs. Gable, for whom Lyra often did small kindnesses like going to the grocery store, had worked for decades as a kitchen maid for one of the most traditional families in Aurelia. As a parting gift upon her retirement, she had received an invitation to the most exclusive event in town, the annual Morley Foundation Benefit Ball. With her legs already tired and no longer interested in that world of appearances, Mrs. Gable had an idea. "You take it, my dear," she had said to Lyra, extending the invitation. "You work so hard, you deserve a princess's night." And who knows what fate has in store for you? Maybe you'll find someone who will listen to your story about Niall. Mrs. Gable's suggestion seemed at first like a far-fetched fantasy to Lyra. Her, at the Morley's ball, with her plain clothes, her work-hardened hands, her lack of social graces to navigate that aquarium of elegant sharks. It would be a recipe for humiliation. She felt like a Cinderella, without a fairy godmother, without a carriage, without the slightest chance of fitting in. Her first reaction was to politely decline, thank her for the gesture, but dismiss the idea as madness. She would spend the evening taking care of Niall as she always did. That was her place, her reality. The world of galas and millionaire philanthropists was not for her. It belonged to another dimension, a dimension she only heard about from the magazines she saw, in the checkout line at the grocery store. But Mrs. Gable's words, maybe you can find someone who will listen to your story about Niall, stuck in her mind like a hook. Hope, that treacherous, resilient emotion she had worked so hard to keep under control, began to bubble. What if it was a chance? One in a million, perhaps, but a chance nonetheless. A chance to be in the same room as renowned doctors, hospital directors, philanthropists who might take an interest in her sister's case. Maybe she could approach someone, tell them Niall's story, hand over a small dossier she had prepared with the tests and her status on the waiting list. The idea was desperate, but desperation was Lyra's natural state these days. The fear of humiliation was immense, but the terror of losing her sister was infinitely greater. Niall, upon learning of the opportunity, became her sister's greatest supporter. From her bedside, with the glow of fever in her eyes, but also with the light of hope, she insisted that Lyra go. You have to go, Lyra. For the first time in years, destiny is giving you a different card to play. Don't waste it out of fear, she argued, her voice weak but full of conviction. Forget the humiliation, think of the possibility, and if it doesn't work out, at least you'll have a good story to tell me. Niall's words, added to the lump of hope that had formed in Lyra's throat, were decisive. She decided to go. She would face the lion's den, not for herself, but for the only person who mattered in her life. The decision was made, and with it a wave of anxiety and a strange determination took over her being. The preparation for the ball was an exercise in creativity and solidarity typical of Vero Plains. Lyra had no money for a formal dress, and the idea of renting one was out of the question. But word of her mission spread quietly through the neighborhood, and the community rallied. Mrs. Gable offered a pair of low-heeled shoes she had barely worn. A neighbor, who worked as a seamstress in a clothing store, took a bolt of dark blue velvet, a forgotten scrap from a past collection, and stayed up all night transforming an old dress model of Lyra's into something simple but surprisingly elegant. Another neighbor, who sold cosmetics through catalogs, showed up with a makeup kit and gave Lyra her first lessons. There was no luxury, but there was affection in every detail of this improvised production. On the night of the ball, when she looked at herself in the cracked mirror in her small room, Lyra almost didn't recognize herself. The dark blue dress highlighted the paleness of her skin and the intensity of her eyes. The discreet makeup hid the dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. For a moment, she allowed herself to dream, to imagine herself as one of Aurelia's ladies, but reality soon brought her back. In her simple bag, she carried not a designer wallet, but an envelope with Niall's exams, and the desperate hope that this night could change her sister's destiny. She said goodbye to Niall with a kiss on the forehead and a wish me luck, and set off towards Aurelia's heart, feeling like a soldier marching into an uncertain and dangerous battle. Arriving at the sumptuous hotel where the ball was being held was an abrupt plunge into an ocean of opulence that left her breathless. Luxury cars with white-gloved chauffeurs glided silently up to the entrance, depositing women wrapped in silk, jewelry, and expensive perfumes. and men in impeccable tuxedos who exuded power and self-confidence. Lushra, who had arrived by bus and walked the last few blocks, immediately felt like a blur, a blemish in the perfect landscape. Every glance she received seemed to dissect her, noting her nondescript dress, her simple shoes, her aura of not belonging. The urge to turn around and run was overwhelming, but the image of Nael's pale face kept her steady. Heart pounding, she walked toward the reception, the elegant invitation in her trembling hands. At the entrance to the main hall, a line of guests waited patiently as their names were checked against a digital list on a tablet held by a receptionist with a practiced smile. When it was Lyra's turn, she handed over her invitation. The receptionist looked at the paper, then at her and back again, her expression changing subtly from a professional smile to a slight frown of suspicion. "Miss Gable?" the receptionist asked, her tone a little too loud, drawing the attention of those around her. No, the invitation is from Mrs. Gable. She couldn't make it and asked me to represent her." Lyra tried to explain, her voice lower than she would have liked. The receptionist exchanged a look with the burly security guard at her side, a look that said, "We have a problem." The bouncer approached, a wall of muscle and authority. "Ma'am, the invitations are personal and non-transferable," he said, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "The name on the invitation does not match yours, and you are not on the confirmed guest list. I ask that you leave immediately to avoid embarrassment." The words were spoken with brutal clarity, each one a small stab at Lyra's pride. The embarrassment was inevitable. The whispers around her grew louder, the stares now openly hostile and curious. She was the intruder, the gatecrasher, the girl from Vero Plains who had dared to dream that she could frequent the same air as the elite of Aurelia. Her face burned, a deep humiliation washing over her, mixed with helpless rage. Lyra was about to obey, to turn and disappear into the night, taking with her the pieces of her shattered dignity, when the course of events was altered by a small but irresistible force. From inside the hall, coming from the direction of the evening's host, Cale Morley, a small figure slipped from her father's hand. It was Ezrin. The boy, who had spent the entire evening listless and silent at Cale's side, suddenly seemed to have seen a ghost, or, rather, an angel. His eyes, usually lost in their own world, fixed on Lyra with an intensity and recognition that shocked her father. And with an energy no one had known he possessed, the boy began to run toward the entrance, toward her. Ezrin's run through the hall caused a small chaos. Kyle, taken by surprise, tried to call him, but the boy didn't hear him. He dodged the guests with unexpected agility, his eyes fixed on Lyra as if she were a magnet. He reached the entrance, panting, his breathing starting to become difficult due to the effort and his asthma. But he ignored his own discomfort. In front of Lyra, the security guard, and the astonished guests, Ezrin didn't say a word. He just opened his arms and hugged her with the strength of someone who finds a safe haven after a long and terrible storm. The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to that extraordinary scene. The reclusive son of billionaire Cale Morley, who according to the gossip could barely tolerate touch, desperately and affectionately hugging the unknown woman who had just been barred from the door. Cale Morley, who had hurriedly followed his son, stopped a few feet away from the scene, paralyzed by a mixture of panic, confusion, and an emotion he couldn't name. He saw his son's embrace, the way the little boy clung to that unknown woman, the smile on her face. And then he looked at her face, and the memory, like a lightning bolt, hit him. The face. It was the same face from Ezrin's drawings. The woman from the park, the anonymous savior who had haunted his son's mind for 2 years. In that instant, Kyle understood everything. Ezrin's reaction, his fixation on the drawings, the reason why the boy had run like that. And at the same time, he realized the cruelty of the situation. The woman who had saved his son's life was being publicly humiliated at the door of her own event. A wave of protective fury, an emotion he hadn't felt so intensely since Ilara's death, took hold of Kyle. Fury against the security guard for his lack of sensitivity, against the guests for their malicious looks, against the system of appearances that he himself had helped to build, and fury against himself for not having met that woman sooner, for not having thanked her, for not knowing of her existence until that moment. He needed to act. He needed to fix this, to protect not only his son, but also that woman from the veracity of that environment. And, in an impulse that defied all his logical and calculating nature, he made a drastic decision, a lie that at that moment seemed the only solution to silence the vultures and to give meaning to that surreal scene. Moving forward with firm steps, Kyle placed a protective hand on Lyra's shoulder, who was still crouched, hugging Ezran, completely stunned. He looked directly at the security guard, his voice as cold as steel. "There has been a grave misunderstanding here," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "This lady is with me. It was my personal staff's fault for not updating the guest list in time." The murmurs in the audience grew louder, curiosity now mixed with awe at the intervention of the mighty Kale Morley. But he knew that was not enough. He needed something more, something definitive, something that would end any speculation and protect Lyra from further questions and humiliation. And then he uttered the sentence that would change the fate of them all. Looking around at the curious faces, then at Lyra with an intensity that made her catch her breath, Kale Morley added, his voice clear and echoing through the now silent hall. "After all, it would be rather impolite and unforgivable of me to bar my own wife from entering." The word wife dropped like a grenade into the room. A shocked silence followed, quickly replaced by a burst of camera phone flashes and a deafening hubbub. Kyle Morley, Aurelia's most eligible and reclusive widower, was married, and was his secret wife the plain-looking, unknown woman who had nearly been thrown out of the ball. The story was a scandal, a bombshell, the news of the year. And Kale, with that one audacious lie, had just thrown Lyra Nellis into the eye of the storm. Lyra felt the world spin. "Wife?" The word echoed in her mind, absurd, terrifying, but at the same time, for a fleeting moment, strangely protective. She looked at Kyle, trying to find some sign of madness in his eyes, but saw only cold determination and a silent message that seemed to say, "Trust me, play along." Ezran, still clinging to her, smiled, oblivious to the earthquake that his father's words had caused. Led by Kale, who kept a firm hand on her back, Lyra was led into the hall through a sea of astonished looks, forced smiles, and poorly disguised whispers. The invisible girl from Vero Plains was now, for all intents and purposes, the mysterious Mrs. Morley, the most envied and talked about woman in Aurelia. The night of the ball turned into a surreal performance for Lyra. She was introduced to senators, CEOs of multinational companies, and heiresses to ancient fortunes. She answered questions about her secret marriage with monosyllabic answers or enigmatic smiles, letting Kyle lead the narrative of this farce. He was brilliant in his acting, inventing a plausible story about a discreet romance away from the spotlight and a recent, intimate wedding to preserve privacy. Lyra felt like a spectator of her own life, an amateur actress thrust into the lead role of a play for which she didn't know the lines. The only real thing amidst that vertigo of appearances was Ezran's little hand, which didn't let go of her for a single instant, her little anchor of truth in that ocean of lies. In a private room, away from the curiosity of the guests, the inevitable conversation between Lyra and Kale took place. The tension was palpable. Lyra, now that the initial shock had worn off, felt a mixture of anger at his audacity and reluctant gratitude for his saving her from humiliation. Kyle, for his part, looked exhausted, his mask of control beginning to crumble. He thanked Lyra for playing along and then tried to explain the situation, Ezran's reaction, the memory of the drawings. "I panicked," he confessed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that made him surprisingly human. "It was the only thing I could think of to protect you, to protect my son's joy. I'm sorry I put you in this situation." Lyra then briefly told him about the incident in the park, about Ezran's asthma attack, something she had done on pure instinct and had never imagined would leave such a deep mark on the boy. Lyra's revelation about saving Ezran seemed to shake Kyle even more. He, with all his wealth and his security apparatus, had not been there to protect his son, but this woman, a complete stranger, had. Gratitude and a certain amount of shame mingled in his gaze. And then, driven by an impulse that was a mixture of paternal desperation and genuine curiosity about this woman, he made a proposal even more shocking than the declaration of marriage. "Ezran needs you," he said, his voice low. His reaction today was proof of that. I would like to ask you to spend some time at my house, just for a few weeks, to be close to him. I will pay you whatever it takes, and maybe we can find a way to help you with your sister." The mention of Nael was the bait that Lyra could not ignore. The possibility, however remote, of using this bizarre situation to get help for her sister was too tempting. But at what cost? Moving to the Morley mansion, living under the same roof as that enigmatic man, maintaining the sham of marriage? It was a dangerous game, one that could cost her her peace of mind and what little she had left of her own identity. She thought about refusing, about returning to her real life, to Nael's problems, to the safety of her little world in Vero Plains. But the image of Ezran's embrace, the memory of the sparkle in his eyes, and the hope that she could finally save Nael spoke louder. With a broken heart, she accepted, but on her own terms. "I'll stay," Lyra said, her voice firm. "But not for your money, Mr. Morley. I'll stay for Ezran, and on the condition that you help me find a solution to my sister's case, using the influence of your foundation, not as a payment, but as a partnership. And this wife farce will have a deadline. Once the dust settles, we'll find a way to part." He weighs amicably. Kyle, relieved and intrigued by Lyra's stance, who was not seduced by his fortune, agreed to all the terms. The pact was sealed, and Lyra Nellis, the girl from the invisible list, prepared to enter the gilded cage of Aurelia's high society once and for all, not knowing whether she would emerge as hunter or prey. Lyra's move to Morley Mansion was a discreet event, but one that fundamentally altered the dynamics of the place. The first few days were filled with an almost palpable strangeness. Lyra felt like an intruder in a museum, careful not to touch anything, so as not to disrupt the silent order of the house. But Ezran was her compass. The boy, now that she was close by, began to transform in a way that astonished everyone. Silence gave way to curious questions, apathy to a childlike energy that sought play and discovery. He followed her around the house, showing her his drawings, explaining his imaginary inventions, and Lyra, with her patience and genuine interest, he validated every small gesture, every new word, building with him a castle of trust and affection. Kyle watched the interaction from a distance, with a mixture of fascination and a twinge of envy. Lyra was getting from Ezran what he, her father, had never been able to. Spontaneous smiles, conversations, hugs. He began to spend more time at home, using the excuse that he had to work from his office. But in reality, he wanted to be close to the atmosphere of lightness that Lyra and Ezran created. He began to participate in their readings, to listen to their conversations, to allow himself to smile at his son's small joys. And in the process, he began to let his guard down, to allow Lyra to see the cracks in his human-robot armor, the vulnerability of a man broken by pain and the fear of loving again. Lyra, for her part, was also beginning to see beyond the cold, ruthless CEO's facade. She saw in Cale a deeply lonely man, haunted by losses he didn't know how to process. She saw a father who loved his son with an almost desperate intensity, but who didn't know how to show that love in a healthy way. And in their nightly conversations, which had become a habit after Ezran went to sleep, she began to challenge him, to question his certainties, to confront him with his own humanity. She realized that Kyle wasn't cruel. He was just a broken man who had forgotten how to feel. And dangerously, she felt a growing empathy for him, a desire to care not only for Ezran, but for this man, who was so powerful and yet so fragile. While the fragile web of affection was being woven inside the Morley mansion, outside, a storm was brewing. Jorna Dravet, Cale's ex-fiancée, had not bought the story of the secret marriage. Daughter of media moguls and a woman accustomed to having everything she wanted, Jorna felt humiliated by the way Kyle had discarded her, and especially by the sudden appearance of that unknown wife. Driven by jealousy and wounded pride, she decided to use her influence to investigate the life of Lyra Nellis. And it didn't take long for her contacts to bring her the truth. Her humble origins in Vero Plains, her sick sister, the borrowed invitation to the ball. Jorna had in her hands the perfect ammunition to destroy Lyra's image, and consequently hit Cale where it hurt most, his reputation as a man of control and perfection. The persecution began subtly, with small blurbs in gossip columns questioning the identity of the mysterious Mrs. Morley. But it quickly escalated into a brutal media attack. Jorna used the newspapers and news portals controlled by her family to paint Lyra as a self-interested con artist. She published photos of Lyra in her humble neighborhood at her old grocery store job, and juxtaposed them with images of her at a gala with venomous captions like "the slum con artist who seduced the lonely billionaire." She distorted facts, invented sources, and created a vicious narrative that portrayed Lyra as a profiteer who had infiltrated the life of a vulnerable man for financial gain. The public, always hungry for a scandal, began to devour the story, and Lyra's image was systematically destroyed. Jorna's smear campaign was overwhelming. Lyra, who had never had her life exposed, suddenly found herself at the center of a hurricane of judgments and accusations. Her face was everywhere, associated with words like fraud, gold digger, impostor. She received hate messages on social media that she didn't even know existed. And worst of all, she saw the worry and tension on Kyle's face, the way he tried to protect her from this attack, but seemed powerless in the face of Jorna's media machine. Lyra began to feel like a burden, a problem that she had caused herself by accepting this farce. The fear of damaging Cale's reputation, of negatively affecting Morley Tech, and most importantly, of causing more pain to Ezran, began to consume her. The pressure became unbearable. Lyra felt the eyes of the mansion's employees on her, now filled with distrust. She heard Cale's tense phone calls with his lawyers and press agents, and she saw the sadness in Nael, who watched everything from afar, grieving for her sister. Lyra came to the painful conclusion that her presence in the Morleys' lives was causing more harm than good. She didn't belong in this world, and her attempt to fit in, even if for good reasons, had turned into a disaster. With her heart in pieces, she made the decision that seemed, to her, the only right one, the only way to protect those she had grown to love, to run away. On a dark, rainy night, while the mansion slept, Lyra wrote a letter to Kyle. In it, she apologized for all the trouble she had caused, explained that she could no longer bear to be the center of this scandal, and that the best thing for everyone was for her to disappear from their lives. She thanked him for the opportunity and the affection, and asked him to take good care of Ezran. For the boy, she left one of her favorite books with a simple and painful dedication to my little hero. Never stop drawing your dreams. With love, Lyra. Then, with the same discretion with which she had arrived, she took a taxi and returned to the only place she knew as her own, the small apartment in Vero Plains, leaving behind a luxurious castle, a makeshift family, and a broken heart. The discovery of Lyra's departure the next morning was a devastating blow to Cale and Ezrin. Cale, upon reading the letter, felt a mixture of anger, despair, and overwhelming guilt. Anger at Jorna for her cruelty, despair at having lost the woman he finally admitted to himself that he loved deeply, and guilt for having failed to protect her. Ezrin, upon realizing that Lyra was gone, fell into an even deeper state of silence than before. He refused to eat, to draw, to interact. The light that Lyra had lit in their lives had been extinguished abruptly and painfully. Morley Manor was once again a place of silence, but now it was a silence filled with unbearable longing and sadness. The press's reaction to Lyra's disappearance was one of cynical triumph. Jorna Dravette quietly exulted, believing she had won the battle. The headlines confirmed her narrative. Con artist disappears after being unmasked. End of the hoax. Mysterious Mrs. Morley escapes. Kyle, consumed with grief and worry for Ezrin, ignored the media noise. His only priority was to find Lyra, to convince her to come back. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. She had left him because she believed he was a burden, and he would need to prove that she was, in fact, the missing piece in his life. And as he lost himself in his thoughts, something extraordinary happened. Ezrin Morley, the silent and fragile boy, took a courageous and determined action that no one could have predicted. Taking advantage of a moment when the security guards and the housekeeper were distracted, who were busy with the crisis that had taken place in the T mansion, he put on his coat, grabbed a sheet of paper and some colored pencils, and sneaked out of the property. He knew where to go. Lyra had always told him about Vero Plains, about the train she took, about the market where she worked. And with the childish logic of someone with a clear mission, Ezrin began his own journey in search of Lyra. A dangerous journey for a 5-year-old boy, but driven by the most powerful force of all, love. Little Ezrin walked through the sophisticated streets of Aurelia to the train station, a route he only knew from the car windows. With disarming ingenuity, he managed to board the train to Vero Plains without paying, blending in with the passengers who, in the rush of their routine, barely noticed the boy alone. Arriving in the suburbs, an environment so different from his own, he was not scared. He began walking, showing everyone he met a drawing he had made along the way, Lyra's face. "Have you seen my Lyra?" he asked, his voice low, almost inaudible. Some people ignored him, others looked at him with pity, but no one knew how to help him. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Ezrin's disappearance was discovered, and panic set in once and for all. Kyle felt his world fall apart when he found out that Ezrin was missing. He called his security team, the police, but in his heart, he knew where his son had gone. He ran to his car, the rain starting to fall heavily on Aurelia, and drove towards Vero Plains, despair and hope fighting a battle in his chest. In Vero Plains, Lyra, who had shut herself in her apartment brooding over her grief, was alerted by a neighbor about a lost boy in an expensive coat looking for a girl named Lyra. Her heart froze. She ran to the street, and there, under the rain that was starting to thicken, she saw him. Ezrin, huddled near the entrance to the market where she worked, holding a makeshift cardboard sign that he had made with the help of a street vendor. And on the sign, in crooked and colorful letters, was written, "Come home." Lyra and Ezrin's reunion, there on the wet sidewalk of Vero Plains, was one of the most moving scenes the neighborhood had ever witnessed. She ran and hugged him with the strength of a lioness protecting her cub, crying with relief, with love, with guilt for having put him through this. Ezrin clung to her, his small body shaking with cold and emotion. And it was at that exact moment that Kyle's car stopped abruptly next to them. He got out. The rain soaking his expensive suit, his face pale with despair and relief. He saw his son in the arms of the woman he loved, and all his defenses, all his emotional walls, crumbled once and for all. Standing before Lyra and Ezran, soaked from the rain and shivering, not from the cold, but from an emotion he could no longer contain, Cale Morley finally allowed himself to be vulnerable. "Lyra," he began, his voice hoarse and choked, "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I failed you. I failed to protect you. But the truth is, since you left, this house hasn't been a home anymore. It's just an empty building. And I'm empty." He looked at his son, then back at her. "You weren't on my guest list. You weren't part of any plan. But you're the only person who's ever been able to get me out of myself, who's ever gotten past my barriers, and I want you to stay. Not as part of a charade, not as a solution to Ezran's problems. I want you to stay because you are, because I love you." Kyle's confession, made there on the raw simplicity of a Vero Plains sidewalk under a storm that seemed to wash away the lies and the hurt, was the truest declaration of love Lyra had ever heard. She saw in his eyes no longer the powerful CEO or the broken man, but a human being, flawed, remorseful, but desperately sincere. And she saw in Ezran, who was still holding her, the embodiment of that love, the bridge that had connected their worlds in such an unlikely way. And there, with her heart still, aching but overflowing with a feeling she could no longer deny, Lyra knew that home was not a place, but wherever those two souls were, and she was home. The months that followed were spent in a slow but solid reconstruction. Kyle and Lyra, now truly together, faced the media in a different way. They called a press conference and side by side told their story with honesty and dignity. They spoke about the initial farce, about the cruelty of Jorna Dravitt's campaign, but above all, about the genuine love that had been born from that unlikely coexistence. Public opinion, faced with such a human and moving truth, quickly turned in favor of the couple, and Jorna, discredited and publicly exposed for her manipulations, ended up withdrawing from public life, her defeat being much more bitter than she had imagined. Kyle and Lyra's wedding was a low-key affair held at the Morley mansion, but attended by their friends and neighbors from Vero Plains, symbolically uniting the two worlds that had now become one. Ezran, radiant in his little suit, was the page boy, carrying the rings with a smile that lit up the entire room. Nael, who watched everything via video call from her hospital bed, cried with happiness for her sister, feeling renewed hope. And indeed, hope materialized shortly after. Kyle, true to his promise to honor the legacy of his late wife Ilara, created the Ilara Morley Foundation, dedicated to financing high-cost medical treatments for patients in the public health system. And the first beneficiary was Nael Nellis, who finally received the kidney transplant that would save her life. The life of the new Morley family found a rhythm of serene and real happiness. The mansion, once cold, was now filled with Ezran's laughter, with the smell of the home-cooked food that Lyra insisted on preparing, with lively conversations during dinners. Kyle learned to delegate more of his work, to value family time, to be a present and affectionate father and husband. Ezran, with the security of Kale and Lyra's love, blossomed in a way that surprised all his doctors and therapists. His asthma attacks became less frequent, and he became a more sociable, more talkative, happier child. And he never stopped drawing. But now his drawings were no longer of a lonely face, but of his family. Kyle, Lyra, and him, always holding hands. Lyra, however, was not content to be just Mrs. Morley. She had not forgotten her origins, nor the invisibility to which so many people like her were subjected. With Kale's support and resources, she created her own organization, the Whitelist Foundation. The name was a direct and symbolic reference to her experience at the ball. The foundation's main goal was to build bridges, to provide opportunities for talented young people from peripheral communities like Vero Plains, helping them to enter elite universities, to get internships at large companies, to participate in cultural and social projects, or simply to have their names included on the lists from which they had previously been systematically excluded. The Whitelist Foundation has become a revolutionary project in Aurelia, challenging the city's invisible barriers and promoting real and effective social inclusion. Lyra, with her practical intelligence and deep empathy, has become a respected and admired leader, not because she is Cale Morley's wife, but because of her work, her vision, and her ability to transform her own pain and anger into an instrument of positive change for hundreds of others. She has proven that true meritocracy only exists when opportunities are equal for all, and she has dedicated her life to fighting for that equality. Cale Morley, along with Lyra, also reinvented himself as a leader and as a man. Inspired by his wife's work and his own personal transformation, he implemented a more humane and socially responsible corporate culture at Morley Tech, with inclusion and talent development programs for underprivileged communities. He understood that the true strength of his company was not only in its cutting-edge algorithms, but in the people who made it up, in their diversity and their potential. The robot Billionaire had given way to a visionary and compassionate leader who understood that the greatest success of an empire is the good it generates for the society around it. Ezrin grew up in this environment of love, security, and purpose. Lyra's constant presence, his father's new light-heartedness, and the coexistence with the children and young people from the Whitelist Foundation who frequently visited the mansion transformed him into a sociable, communicative, and incredibly empathetic boy. His asthma attacks became increasingly rare, as if the health of his soul was reflected in that of his body, and he continued to draw no longer the face of an anonymous savior, but the smiling faces of his family, his friends, of a world that, thanks to the courage of his heartfelt mother, had become a much more welcoming and colorful place for him. The city of Aurelia, once a symbol of division and exclusivity, slowly began to feel the impact of these transformations. The symbolic bridge between the elegant center and the periphery of Vero Plains, once merely physical, began to become a social and cultural one as well, with the projects of the Whitelist Foundation promoting an exchange and mutual recognition that had previously seemed impossible. The story of Lyra and Cale, which had begun as a scandal, had become a local legend, an example that social barriers can indeed be broken down, and that love and empathy are the most powerful tools for this construction. Years later, at another Morley Foundation benefit ball, the scene at the entrance was very different from what it had been years ago. Lyra Nellis Morley, now one of the event's hosts, greeted guests with an elegance and confidence that radiated from within. Beside her, Cale gazed at her with a love and admiration that had only deepened with time. And running around the room, now a lively preteen, was Ezrin, laughing with a group of friends, some from wealthy families in Aurelia, others from Vero Plains, all of whom benefited from the Whitelist Foundation's projects. The barriers were slowly being broken down. At that same event, Lyra took the stage to announce the new batch of scholarship recipients for her foundation, and in her speech, she recalled her own story, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. "A few years ago," she said, her voice firm and emotional, "I was turned away from this very room. I wasn't on the list. And for a long time, I believed that I didn't belong here. But today, I know that our place is where our hearts take us, where our courage allows us to go. And the goal of the Whitelist Foundation is simple: to ensure that no talent is lost, that no voice is silenced, that no dream is turned away at the door because they don't have the right last name or zip code. The list is now blank, ready to be filled by all of you." The applause that followed was long and warm, an acknowledgement not only of the Foundation's work, but of this extraordinary woman's journey. Cale, in the audience, applauded with tears in his eyes. his heart overflowing with pride. He had found in Lyra not only the love of his life, but his moral compass, the person who had awakened him from his emotional slumber and taught him the true meaning of the word legacy. And Niall, now fully recovered and working alongside her sister at the foundation, saw in Lyra the embodiment of the strength and justice she had always known she possessed. The story of Lyra, Cale, and Ezrin has become one of those inspiring stories that remind us of the power of unexpected encounters. It has shown that love is not a miracle that falls from the sky, but a daily construction made up of listening, empathy, the courage to be vulnerable, and the willingness to tear down one's own walls. And it has proven that children, with their pure perception and their ability to love without filters, are often our best moral compasses, capable of guiding us along the most tortuous paths towards our own redemption. The city of Aurelia, once so rigid in its divisions, continued its slow transformation. The bridge between the elegant center and the outskirts of Vero Plains, once just a train line, began to become a two-way street, with more exchange, more opportunities, more mutual recognition. The invisible list that had once determined the fate of so many began to fade, giving way to a new list, a blank list, where each person had the chance to write their own story, with their own colors, with their own voice. And it all began with a borrowed invitation, a makeshift dress, and the courage of a woman who refused to remain invisible. And so the Morley family, forged in adversity and in the union of opposing worlds, found their own form of happiness, a real happiness, imperfect but deeply meaningful. Kyle, the human robot, had learned to feel. Lyra, the invisible girl, had found her voice and her power. And Ezrin, the silent boy, continued to draw, no longer the face of an anonymous savior, but the smiling faces of his family, living proof that sometimes the happiest endings are not those in fairy tales, but those that we ourselves, with courage and love, learn to build. The press, which had once been Lyra's tormentor, over time began to portray her as an icon of resilience and empowerment. Jorna Dravet's story became a case study in journalism schools about the dangers of media manipulation and lack of ethics. The collapse of her credibility was a bitter reminder that the truth, no matter how much it is attacked and distorted, has a strength of its own that eventually finds its way to the light. The narrative she tried to impose, that of the swindler from the outskirts, was completely supplanted by the real story, that of the strong woman who faced prejudice and used her experience to create opportunities for others. Justice, in that case, did not come from the courts, but from the force of public opinion, which, once confronted with the truth, knew how to recognize the heroine and the villain of that plot. The Alara Morley Foundation and the Whitelist Foundation, though focused on different issues, often worked together to create an ecosystem of support that ranged from basic healthcare to access to higher education and employment. Cale and Lyra became one of the most influential and respected philanthropic couples in the country, known not for giving money, but for getting personally involved in each project, getting their hands dirty, and listening to the real needs of the communities they served. They proved that effective philanthropy is not about charity, but about empowerment, about giving people the tools to build their own futures so they can write their names on the lists that really matter. Niall, now fully healthy, found in her work at the foundation a new passion and a new meaning for the life she had almost lost. Her own experience as a patient in the public health system made her an invaluable advisor, able to understand the anguish and difficulties of families seeking help. The relationship with her sister, Lyra, which had always been the pillar of her existence, deepened even further, now in a partnership of work and purpose. Together, they were a force of nature, combining Niall's empathy with Lyra's pragmatism to create a lasting and meaningful impact on the lives of hundreds of people. Their gratitude for each other and for the turn of events that fate had brought them was the driving force behind their daily actions. Morley Manor, once a castle of isolation, was now a vibrant home and a meeting place for dreamers. Cale found happiness not in the cold perfection his father had taught him to seek, but in the beauty of imperfection, in the warmth of human relationships, in the organized mess of family life. He learned that being vulnerable was not a weakness, but the gateway to the deepest and truest connections. And his love for Lyra, a love born of chaos and lies, became the most solid and unshakable truth of his existence. And Ezrin, the boy who started a quiet revolution with a hug, grew up to be a young man of remarkable empathy and creativity, proving that healing, both physical and emotional, often begins with a simple gesture of connection. Lyra Nellis Morley never forgot where she came from. She returned to Vero Plains often, not as the billionaire's wife, but as Lyra herself, to talk to her old neighbors, to support local businesses, to ensure that her foundation's projects were truly making a difference in the lives of the community. She was the living bridge between the two worlds, proof that it was possible to belong to both without losing your essence, your integrity, and your sense of justice. Her story was a constant reminder that the power to transform society lies not only in grand philanthropic gestures, but also in the ability to listen, to understand, and to fight alongside those who are systematically ignored. Their story, in the end, was not just about an unlikely romance or overcoming social barriers. It was about building a family from broken pieces, building bridges over chasms of prejudice, building a better future on the foundations of empathy and justice, and building oneself. A painful but liberating process that Cale and Lyra faced together, proving that the strongest people are not those who never fall, but those who have the courage to get up, to reinvent themselves, and to help others do the same. On a sunny afternoon, Cale, Lyra, and Ezrin sat in the same park where, years before, Ezrin's life had been saved by a stranger. They watched the children playing, the life pulsing around them. "You know," Cale said, holding Lyra's hand, "I think that, in the end, the three of us were saved that day." Lyra smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I think so. Sometimes we just need someone to really see us so we can start to heal." And Ezrin, now a young man who spoke with the confidence of someone who had found his voice, added, "And sometimes a hug can be the beginning of the most beautiful story of all." And they sat there in silence, the three of them, the embodiment of an unlikely but deeply happy family, a family that had learned that true love is the only name that is never left off any list.